G'day everyone, thanks again for joining us. We really appreciate you giving up your valuable time to come along to our webinars. If you've been to one before, welcome back. If you're new to our webinar series, they're just an opportunity for us to look at what's going on out there. We look at the Australian Transport Safety Bureau data for accidents and incidents, and we try and pick stuff that's topical and that we see is still happening out there. We try and dissect what's happening, look at some causal factors, and then try and learn from those causal factors to apply it to our own flying to make sure we reduce the chances of these things happening to us as aviators. I think it's an important thing to do as an aviator to keep that sort of constant state of vigilance when it comes to safety. So thanks for joining us today for the discussion. For those who haven't met me, I'm Craig. I'm one of the Aviation Safety Advisors for CASA. And when we have these webinars, we bring along a guest speaker. And our guest speaker today, hopefully we're just trying to get hold of Wayne. He's having some tech issues, but Wayne Ovens is our guest speaker today. Wayne has over 16,000 hours in both RAF and large commercial aircraft, and most of them in a checking and training role. He's just recently retired, so he's now a man of leisure. He held a chief pilot position for 30 years at National Jet Express. He also owns a Glass Air 3. He's actively involved in the experimental aircraft scene, and he's participated in and coordinated 3 of the Outback Air races. So he's got a lot of experience across a broad range, and we're really looking forward to hearing from him. So today's topic, we're talking about staying on the strip. We're talking about runway excursions. So why are we talking about runway excursions? Well, it's a persistent type of accident and incident in the ATSB safety data. We still see it continuing to happen for a number of reasons, and they're the sort of incidents and accidents that we want to talk about here to put them at our front of mind. Broadly speaking, we can classify them into 2 categories, those that occur on takeoff and those that occur on landing. And we'll try and sort of differentiate between the 2 today. It's important we differentiate between the 2 because the causal factors, as we'll see from a couple of case studies, can vary significantly depending on, what the incident was. Some of the times when we see these incidents, it's factors that are largely outside of the pilot's control. We know as aviators there's things that can happen that we're not expecting. Perhaps an animal runs out onto the runway, takes out one of our main wheels, and we lose directional control and off the runway we go. Perhaps a vehicle comes out in front of us and we've no option but to get off the runway and not hit the vehicle. So there are things out of our control and they're hard to predict and can be challenging to deal with. What I really want to concentrate on today is those ones that are within our control. And we see it happening quite regularly where these incidents are occurring for reasons that are actually reasonably easy to avoid. Typically, when we see runway excursions for easily avoidable reasons, it's because a pilot hasn't either followed an established procedure or followed established good airmanship principles with respect to the stability of the takeoff or the landing. So we want to understand why they're occurring so that we can reduce the chances of it happening to us. So we'll discuss a couple of case studies. They're going to sort of illustrate for us, if you like, some of the causal factors. If you've been to webinars before where we talk about case studies, you know what I'm about to say. We don't look at these case studies with a view of pointing at the pilot and saying, gee, I'd never do that. That would never happen to me. These are people like you and I. On any given day, all of us are capable of making poor decisions for a whole variety of reasons. As human beings, we're very complex critters, and we know from our human factors studies there's all sorts of influences on our decision on any given day. So we look at these things with a view of not looking at the pilot and think, I'd never do that. What we want to do is take that mindset of, let's see what happened. How can I learn the lessons from that and reduce the chances of it happening to me? So with the case studies, we'll have a look at the causal factors, and then we'll talk about some mitigation strategies that you and I can use to help prevent these runway excursions happening to us. And then we're going to be joined by Wayne, our guest speaker, who's going to give us his thoughts from his vast experience on this particular safety topic. So let's have a look at the first case study. This one occurred in March 2017. It was a G8 air van, and it was a pilot plus 3 passengers. and it was a runway overrun on takeoff. And the interesting thing about this case study, or one of the interesting things, is that we can see the pilot in this case makes an attempt to mitigate the risk of a takeoff on a largely, rustic runway, if you like, a grass runway. So this isn't an act of carelessness or anything like that. They took some strategies trying to mitigate the risks on this takeoff, but unfortunately it didn't work. This was the runway they were operating on. It's a grass runway. It's 800 metres long. As you can see, it's on a coastal area there. And there's a slight rise in the middle. It's shown by that dotted line with crest. The rotate speed for this particular aircraft was 58 knots. Before the takeoff, there was another company aircraft at this airfield. It wasn't an Airvan, if I remember rightly, it was something like Cessna 210. And they'd actually try to mitigate the risk of the takeoff on the short runway by spreading the load, the passenger load, etc., across the two aircraft. They'd also, or the pilot of the Airvan at least, had also nominated a decision point for the takeoff. And the decision point for that takeoff was just at the crest of the runway, about halfway. And obviously, they were going to check the acceleration of the aircraft at that decision point, make the decision whether they're going to continue the takeoff or abort the takeoff. The pilot commenced the takeoff, and at the decision point, the airspeed had increased to 40 knots. The pilot was happy with that level of acceleration and continued the takeoff. But then shortly thereafter, unexpectedly, the aircraft started to decelerate. It was only a short period of deceleration. It seemed to be something wrong with the runway surface, a bit soft, and the aircraft decelerated but then started re-accelerating, so the pilot was happy to continue. But unfortunately, just before the rotate point, they hit another patch of soft runway and the aircraft decelerated a bit more rapidly this time. So much so, but by the time the aircraft got to the end of the runway, it only had a speed of 50 knots. With a rotate speed of 58 knots, it wasn't enough to get the aircraft safely airborne, and unfortunately the aircraft ran off the end of the runway. As we'll see from the next photo, the area they ended up in was rocky. It was really not a good spot to be, sort of going into after a runway overrun. The pilot did manage, with the airspeed available, to clear a bit of a sudden drop at the end of the runway and somewhat cushion the aircraft onto the rocks, and the end result was this. So now we're looking down the runway in the direction of takeoff. We can see the aircraft, the pilot managed to keep it upright, which was a good effort, but it is badly damaged. Now, there were no serious injuries. The passengers were fine. The pilot did suffer a broken ankle, and I'm not suggesting that's not a serious and painful injury, but I think as aviators, if we look at that picture and realise what's happened, we could consider that the people on that aircraft very lucky. So luckily, in this case, everyone's around afterwards to talk about it, but we can see a number of factors there that were considered and strategies put in place to reduce the risk, distributing the load, having a decision point. But then after that point, some unexpected events happened, which caused the takeoff to go awry. So we'll talk more a little bit about this when we talk to Wayne, what we can learn from that case study, but that's an example of the sort of runway excursion we're seeing on takeoff. The second case study that I want to chat to you about is one that occurred on landing. So this one occurred in March 2014. It was a Cessna 150, and in this case it was a pilot and one passenger. And as I mentioned, this one occurred on landing. So if we look at what happened, basically, the pilot elected to use a grass runway that had a quartering headwind. So far, so good. Realised he was slightly higher than normal on approach, and I want you to keep that in mind later on when we talk about mitigation strategies for these types of overruns. And then they encountered some minor turbulence, and that had the effect of basically yawing the aircraft quite sharply to the right and putting it off centre line, so that 100 feet the aircraft isn't quite in a stabilised approach at this stage and required some correction to get it back onto centre line. The aircraft touched down long and basically was not exactly in control, and it veered off the runway to the left, rolled down a slope, and the nose wheel impacted a tyre being used as a hazard marker. Thankfully, no injuries in this case. So this is another one we can talk about, thankfully, where we're, the people involved can tell us what happened and we can learn from it. So that was the end result. If you look at that, you see that aircraft is being propped up by a jack at the front there. The nose wheel is collapsed and there's obviously damage to the prop there from where it impacted the ground under power. So that's the sort of runway excursion we're seeing on landing. And if we go back and have a look at the reasons that occurred, the causal factors, we'll talk a little bit about stabilised approach criteria and why that's so important when we make that decision to either continue the landing or knock it off, go around and try again. In this case, after the incident, the pilot remembers looking at the windsock and seeing it swing quite wildly between south-southeast to south-southwest. And he believes that, wind shear may have been a factor in the loss of control on the runway. While we're waiting for Wayne, I guess we'll just reflect back on the two case studies that we saw there. If we talk about the one on landing first, we talked about stabilised approach criteria. We've actually got a webinar that you can watch as a recording on stabilised approach criteria. I trawl through a lot of case studies, accident case studies, when we prepare for these webinars, and it's quite, I won't say amazing, it's staggering how many people continue a landing when they don't have stabilised approach criteria. So we really encourage people, if you work for an organisation, typically those approach criteria will be in your ops manual. So pilots are taught them as part of the onboarding for the airline or the company, and they have specific gates that they have to reach on finals, where if they are not in a stabilised approach condition, they are obliged to go around. So I guess we need to understand what constitutes a stabilised approach and what gate are we as aviators going to use to make sure that if we're not stabilised by that point on finals, we're going to make the decision to go around. So stabilised approach criteria, typically your airspeed will be stable at the correct speed, your configuration will be stable and basically trimmed, your aim point will be correct and your aspect will be correct, and you'll be established on centerline. It does sound easy, I know. You're thinking, well, why would you land if that wasn't the case? But unfortunately, we still see it happening. Then what we want to do is give ourselves hard gates, if you like. Now, what the gate is really up to you. It'll depend on the aircraft type, the amount of kinetic energy it carries on finals and onto the runway, your recency, your experience, etc. But, typically something like perhaps 500 feet on finals, that's your decision point. And even just having a hard decision point to ask yourself, is the approach stable? Yes or no? Continue, don't continue. So that's one method we use to try and encourage people to check their approach criteria and go around if it's not safe. With respect to takeoff, we saw those crews do a lot of good things there. They distributed the weight, but one of the big ones is they gave themselves a decision point on takeoff. That's really important to do. It will depend on what sort of data we have available for the aircraft performance. Some aircraft come with quite extensive takeoff data, some not so much. We have to sort of learn through experience or talking with other owners and then take into account the conditions on the day. We also have to decide what is a reasonable acceleration rate. When I get to that decision point, what is a safe speed that will see me accelerate to my rotate speed with enough runway remaining? And that's going to require a little bit of research into the performance data and a bit of experience on the aircraft type. So we strongly encourage people to do that and then make that decision if they're not happy at that decision point to abort the takeoff. So I'll get the presentation going again, and I'm just going to go through some mitigation strategies that you and I can think about when we are looking at runway excursions and how we can avoid them or reduce the chances of them happening to us. First of all, we need to understand our aircraft's performance data. If you've flown large aircraft, that's usually pretty easy. The charts are good. They take into account all of the environmental conditions on the day, and we end up coming out with quite an accurate answer of how much runway we need to either land or take off. So if you don't have that sort of data with your aircraft, talk to other owners, talk to the manufacturer, notice how quickly the aircraft accelerates when you do takeoffs, etc., and really get to understand what is a normal acceleration rate versus non-normal. And based on that, we can plan decision points for our takeoffs. So we can say, as this crew did in the first case study there, if I haven't, accelerated to this airspeed by that point, I will abort the takeoff. And it's really clear and important that we need to make that decision and get ready to make that decision on takeoff. If we pre-brief it, it's going to be easier to do. Mentally rehearse your abort procedures. Much like a go-round, an abort shouldn't be seen as an abnormal situation. We may have to abort a takeoff for a multitude of reasons. Someone comes onto the runway, another aircraft, vehicle, animal, etc. Maybe we realise the door's not closed properly, etc. So mentally rehearse them. Obviously, if you have access to a simulator, it's great to be able to rehearse them in a simulator as well. That way, if you need to do them in the real case, then it's not going to be such an issue for you. It's going to be an easier decision to make when you are happy to do that. Sorry, just notice that comment from Reza there. Admin needs to give permission to Wayne to unmute. Thank you very much for that. I'll get Talia to just have a look at that and see if she can work on that one. Thanks for that, Reza. What else can we do? A comprehensive brief prior to every takeoff. And you know what? I reckon most, if not all of us, are doing that. If you've been unable to do that or you've stopped doing that, then now's a reminder to keep doing that. And looks like we've got Wayne here. I'll just finish these points, Wayne, and then we'll get back to you. Well done.
Sure.
So, yeah, comprehensive brief prior to every takeoff. It is easy if we do that time and time again to just sort of say the words and not think about what we're talking about. So, it's one of those things where we could say it thousands of times in our flying careers and never have to use it. Or if we do have to use it, it might be once or twice. But we really need to listen to what we're saying, get ready to carry out the actions if we are not at the right acceleration rate if something adverse happens. We talked about the stabilised approach criteria, really important. Go back to your ops manual if you work for an organisation, see what it is, get ready to comply with it. If you don't work for an organisation, if you're flying recreationally, privately, think about what your stabilised approach looks like. Use the guidance that's out there. It's fairly straightforward. Understand what speed you should be at, what configuration you should be at, that you're trimmed, that the power is stable, the airspeed is stable, just requiring minor, sort of corrections. Your aspect to the runway is correct, and that your aim point is correct. You're not pointed too far down the runway or prior to the threshold. Get all the information you need on the runway that you're using. That's really important. The surface, as we saw in that first case study there, surface is really important. And look, sometimes that's going to be tricky because the information available can be limited. So our next webinar is going to be on how to access all the information you can possibly get for a runway, particularly runways that don't, usually have a lot available. And of course, learn from these previous accidents and incidents. No one here, we've got 92 people online. Every single one of us is a human being. Every single one of us should know that we are susceptible to error. So let's learn the hard lessons from other people if we can, and then apply those lessons to our flying. So I'll stop the presentation there. We're going to bring on Wayne. Thanks for joining us, Wayne. It's good you got here. It's really good you could make it, mate. Thanks for coming along again. So you've a lot of hours there, 16,000. That's a considerable experience there. Any experience with runway excursions in that time?
I've had one personal one on mine, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But generally, a lot of the ones that I read a lot of crash comments, and a lot of things came over my desk with large aircraft doing overruns. And a lot of the things that happen with those large aircraft overruns is bad weather, unstabilized approaches, and all of those points that you brought up apply to large aircraft just as well as a small aircraft. And so it's really, they're the main ones that come to mind. There's been there's an aircraft in Newman overran. We've just had an E190 in South Africa overran the runway and went off the end. And they're just two that popped to mind. It's sharing all of the safety events are important, and knowing what your things on there. So that's mainly how I work with it there is stabilized approaches. And yeah, for our large aircraft, we know the aircraft performance. We know where we're going to. We know the runway lengths and all of those things. That's the main thing for large aircraft. So it's only things outside our control that cause these overruns, or if we're not doing the stabilized approaches.
And we know with smaller aircraft, because of the differences in inertia too, and those who have flown large aircraft and small aircraft will probably understand what I'm saying here. You know, a small crosswind in a large aircraft is probably not a big deal, but in a small aircraft without that inertia, it can actually be a pretty big deal on a runway, especially when you're low airspeed, you know, just ready to rotate, for example.
Yep, and that was the event that I actually had on my glass air. Was on a gravel runway, little town called Mora, which is just north of Perth. And Craig's just bringing up. I hope he's going to bring up a picture of it.
I am.
You can find it.
Yep.
It's I'd landed. He'll bring it up. I'd landed there early in the morning. I'd gone up to visit my father in Mora, and when I landed, there was calm, light winds, and then when I went to leave in the afternoon, the wind had come out from the southwest, which is a pure crosswind on this runway. So the wind was coming probably up at least 15 knots. The windsock was down on the far end, and it wasn't quite full straight out, so it's around about 15 knots. The instance that I had, so I elected to take off to the northwest. And as I backtrack down there, you'll see the circle there is trees, and there's effectively a funnel feature of those two trees, a large bank of trees. The trees are probably 5 or 6 meters high in those two trees areas. And I looked down there and I noticed as I backtracking that this is going to be quite a change of the wind as I roll down the runway. So here I am. The glass has got quite a fair amount of power, and I need just about full rudder and an occasional touch of right brake to keep it on centre line when I apply full power, especially on a gravel runway. So I was going down the runway. I got to about probably doing about 40 or 50 knots as I entered into this area where the wind was coming up, and immediately I ran out of rudder, and it felt like I was sliding sideways on the gravel runway, which and at that point there I didn't want to actually reject and stop on the gravel runway with that crosswind. So I actually reduced a bit of the power. So that took some of the rudder effect away, continued accelerating with reduced power, and then got it back under control, and then reapplied the power, and then safely got airborne. A little bit of a concern, but that was about as close as I got to actually running off a runway with crosswind. And I've realised now that I do have a crosswind limit on that aircraft.
Yeah, and I think that's a decision point. That's one of the hardest ones, isn't it? You know, you've got that problem, so your decision is, should I abort the takeoff, or is it going to be worse to do that, or should I continue for a bit, get it under control, then abort, etc., depending on how much runway I've got. Decisions that have to be made in a split second. So some of that mental preparation, mental rehearsal we talked about, we can't anticipate every single situation, but, you know, at least we can give ourselves a little bit of a head start. Yeah, so we talked about the approach criteria. You mentioned that already, Wayne. We saw how that maybe could have prevented that problem in the second case study. Why do you think pilots don't comply with approach criteria, stabilised approach criteria?
A lot of it comes down to self-imposed stressors and the expectation that, you know, I need to get it on the ground. I need to, you know, someone behind me, or you have to go around. I'll have to do another circuit and things like that. So these are self-imposed stressors. There's no one forcing you to go around to land. And landings, you know, we always say in big aircraft, landing's an option at the end. And even almost to the touchdown point, there's enough power in just about every aircraft to go around. You have to manage it. And the unprepared go around is always, that's the hardest one to actually do, where everything looking nice and you get down there and then suddenly something happens, you've got to go around. That's the one that will catch you out. If you're not in the right configuration, going around, you've got full flap on there, there's lots of drag, and everything else changes and the pitch changes.
Yeah, it's amazing how many of those incidents we've seen where the decision to continue is based on non-safety requirements. Like you say, it could be the schedule for that aircraft. Yeah, it could be as simple as you don't want to, look silly in front of your passengers. Some pilots sort of treat a go around as an admission of defeat almost, but it's actually a normal part of flying, right? There's a whole bunch of reasons the approach might not be stable, and as you said, we should maybe approach it as it'll probably be a go round, but everything looks good, I'll continue for the landing if everything's good. So with respect to the other case study where it was for a takeoff, do you have any tips on strip inspections? What sort of stuff are we looking for there that might catch us out?
Do like I did on that one there, have an assessment of what the wind is going to like, if there's anything that's different. The condition of the runway, if the runway is wet, that's always a concern. Most GA pilots are fair weather pilots. I'm going back to that stage now. If I don't like the weather, I'm not going to go flying, and that's the whole process. Don't get pushed into a corner. Knowing, takeoff ones, you can actually backtrack. You can actually have a look at the runway and make an assessment of it while you're backtracking. Don't do a intersection departure. Use the full length of the runway. Runway behind you is one of those things that's pretty useless. Yep, that's just all of those things. Just have a plan before you start the flying power and going.
And in that takeoff scenario we saw there, where the pilot did the right thing and nominated a decision point, checked the airspeed of the decision point, they're happy with that. But then the deceleration occurred. So if we get something unexpected like that after the decision point, all of a sudden our decision point might not be relevant anymore. That was based on us continuing to accelerate normally. Easy to say, as we're sitting comfortably in the office here and looking at what happened and know the outcome, but perhaps a consideration could have been when that initial deceleration occurred that, they could have aborted the takeoff. With respect to picking those decision points for takeoff, particularly, as we said, in big aircraft, typically we've got good information. We've got runway distance to go markers and all that sort of stuff. What sort of advice can you give for people on how and what to pick as decision points for smaller runways?
Smaller runways and small aircraft, I have a couple of points. One is on the first application of power. Make sure the engine is responding as I expect, so I get full RPM and everything else is going. There's no coughs and things. And the next point there is making sure I have an airspeed indicator. Getting airborne, there's lots and lots of pilots have got no airspeed. And it just makes life, the airplane will still fly, just makes it a lot harder to actually get a correct landing again. That's the next stop point. The other part from after that is when you're going to rotate and see what you are going to do if the end of the runway is coming up. There's not much else you can do. At that point. It's too late. Then you have to make a decision very early in the piece.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier, important to actually mentally rehearse that abort procedure so it's there ready to go. I'm a big advocate for what we call chair flying. Closing your eyes, imagining the scenario, moving your hands where they're going to go on the controls, etc. And it's really important we do that so that we're ready to go for when the if it happens to us. Well, thanks for that, Wayne. That's a great insight. I hope you can hang around if we've got any questions at the end there. So if people have got questions, please feel free to type them in the chat section. We'll address those in a short while. But before we do that, I'm just going to get the presentation going again just to finish off a few points, and then we'll get into the Q&A if people have got questions. Okay, we went through what we can do to mitigate the risks, and there they are there just as a reminder. Some of the things we can learn from the case studies and take on board some of the things that Wayne's mentioned there. So before we go to our question and answer section, just a couple of reminders. We're always looking for your close calls. Have you had an experience that you think people can learn from? We'd love to hear about it. You can submit that to our close call section there, flightsafetyaustralia.com/submit, and if we do publish a close call, you get $500, which is pretty nice. So we'd love to learn from your experiences, and I hope you'd be prepared to share them. When we talk about this safety topic and all the other safety topics that are important at the moment, we have a lot of information on the Pilot Safety Hub. If you're not familiar with the Pilot Safety Hub, please become familiar with it. There's really good stuff on there, animations, you've got stories from other pilots, quizzes, videos, all sorts of stuff. So really highly recommend that one to you. Some great information there that you can use as discussion starters with your fellow aviators. Please feel free to join us for our next webinar. As I mentioned earlier, our next webinar, we're going to be talking about assessing the aerodrome serviceability at non-controlled aerodromes, and we've seen how that can adversely impact a takeoff today in one of our case studies. And would you like to be a guest speaker with us? We're always looking for people from the aviation community to join us on these webinars as our guest speaker. You might have a particular safety topic that you're quite passionate about. Perhaps you've had some experiences in a certain safety issue that you'd like to share with people. We'd love to build a presentation around that with you. So if you are interested in doing that, please contact us, and I'd be happy to chat with you, and we'd be happy to have you along. So we'll just have a look at any questions that we've got. So I'm going to just stop my presentation there, and we'll go to the chat. Okay. Is CASA in consultation with chief pilots of training organisations, flying schools regarding this subject? Major airlines cover this comprehensively. Thanks, Rob, for that question. Look, your experience, Wayne, obviously the airlines do a good job of reinforcing this sort of stuff with respect to stabiliser criteria, decision points on takeoff. With respect to the smaller organisations, Rob, we do, I guess, indirectly liaise with everyone in the community by putting education events on. One-on-one, probably not, unless an organisation asks for it. Sometimes we'll go into an organisation and address specific issues that they want to chat about. But it's certainly something we push on the general education side of things. And of course, the ATSB has some really good training material as well. And Andrew has said, I can share our published stable approach criteria we use in flight training if anyone's interested. Absolutely, Andrew. That's why we're here, to share information. And, you know, with respect to stabilised approach criteria, one person's might be very slightly different to another's. They have really common themes, obviously, but, you know, some people accept a VREF final speed +5 -0. Some people, aircraft type, they might be +10 -0, etc. But anything you can share, we very much appreciate that. It's a really good forum to do it. Vince is said there, perhaps off topic, I always get stressed landing on a one-way runway, knowing I have to backtrack to exit, knowing there is an aircraft close behind me, and I won't have time to clear the runway because the aircraft's close behind me. Vince, that's a really good point. We talked about the stresses involved in pilots pushing a situation that's not favourable. If you know the aircraft's behind you already before you touch down, you're thinking, God, I've got to get this aircraft on the ground. I've got to get it stopped. I've got to get it turned around. So you're working, you know, sort of 3 steps ahead instead of, you know, concentrating on the landing. And I think it's a really good point you raise about how we can get ourselves pushed into a situation by our own pressure. In the end, my advice would be to put yourself in the position of that aircraft behind you. You know, if that was you, would you want someone to push a bad situation so you could get on the ground? I think the answer there for all of us is no. So yeah, my advice would be just concentrate on your landing. Don't worry about anything else until you're safely stopped on the runway, and then you can decide if it's going to be safe for that person to land. It's obviously going to be their decision, but it's a really good point when we have that number of factors working against us. Phil has said that should always consult PLH, takeoff and landing charts, and AC 9102 when using an unfamiliar field. Yeah, that's a good point, Phil. AC 9102. All of that information is available to help us, and the more information we can get on that airfield and the more information we know about our aircraft and its performance, the better off we'll be. Steve, thanks for your comment there. There have been a number of runway misaligned events on takeoff at different aircraft types and at different locations. What is CASA's view to help address the number of occurrence of aircraft misidentifying runway centerline on takeoff? Yeah, that's a good one. Wayne, did you mention an incident
Yep.
similar to that? I think it was on landing though.
We had one of our 146s landed off the centre line on a runway. Generally, it was due to once again a wind effect, a lot of dust blowing. It was on a gravel runway where the gravel runway had lots of cones. You had cones on the runway position and then cones on the outside for the runway strip. And instead of landing between the centre section of runway cones, they actually landed on the left-hand side because that was what he rolled out on finals. The expectation was to land between the cones. It landed between the cones, got down to taxi speed and said, there's more cones to the right of me than I expected. There's a lot of options there to assist in that. Use of EFBs, the fourth flighter's got a massive EFB capacity to actually tell you if you're not lined up on the runway. And especially if you have an EFS display on your, for the Garmin stuff has there as, information actually shows you the runway out the front on EFS. So there's for technology assists you a lot. Looking outside the runway, looking outside and identifying. A lot of people actually make a common lined up. People have it as their SOP is lining up on runway, and they note the runway they're lining up on, and they can actually notify it as at the intersection as well.
Mm. And obviously an issue for landing and takeoff, Steve. You referencing the takeoff here. It's a good point there as well. Typically, when we've seen incidents like this, you may recall, I think it might have been Singapore Airlines a few years back that took off on a runway I think that was being worked on. So it all boils down from CASA's perspective to runway markings and taxiway markings, Steve. We've got Part 139 that really stipulates the correct markings to try and minimise the chances of that occurring. So that's how we try and get around it, with runway marking and obviously training of crews. But it's a really good point you raised there. So that looks like it's the end of the questions. Thanks so much for those and those comments. We really appreciate it. That concludes the presentation today. We hope you can join us for the next one. Thanks very much for giving up your valuable time. Wayne, thanks so much for joining us and giving up your time and sharing your experiences, mate. It's very valuable.
Okay. I'm glad I managed to get on.
Yeah, no worries at all. So are we. And thanks again, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll get a date to you and a time for our next event. We're still yet to decide that, and that one's going to be on getting information for the runway that you're using. Thanks again. Goodbye.